Recently, a dramatic new flare-up of recent hostilities erupted between the United States and Iran. To understand this crisis, we need to look at the background of U.S.-Iranian relations, the recent provocations by Iran and its proxies, the details of the U.S. strikes on Iranian targets, Iran's response, and how the entire world is reacting to this crisis. The US and Iran have been adversaries for decades. More than 40 years after the 1979 Islamic Revolution, ties remain tense as Iran presses ahead with nuclear programs and regional influence. The two sides briefly cooperated on civilian nuclear power before 1979, but relations soured completely after the revolution and subsequent hostage crisis. Now in 2015, the US and allies negotiated a nuclear deal to limit Iran's enrichment, but in 2018, President Trump withdrew from that deal and reimposed sweeping sanctions. As a result, the Iranian economy suffered severely and hardline elements gained a lot more power. The US even designated Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps a foreign terrorist organization. Throughout this period, Iran continued to advance its ballistic missile program and to arm proxies across the entire Middle East, from Hezbollah in Lebanon to militias in Iraq and Syria and the Houthi rebels in Yemen. In short, the two countries have been locked in a low-level proxy conflict for years. This historical context, sanctions, nuclear tensions, and proxy warfare set the stage for the crisis that just exploded. Now, in the months leading up to this current crisis, Iran and its allied militias have been stepping up attacks on U.S. interests. After the October 2023 started Hamas-Israel war, Iran-backed Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria launched roughly 200 attacks on U.S. and allied positions. U.S. forces retaliated with some strikes on those militia positions. For example, in November of 2024, U.S. warplanes bombed 9 Iranian-backed targets in eastern Syria in response to a rocket attack on American troops. Meanwhile, Iran's Houthi allies in Yemen hinted that they might resume attacks on international shipping in the Red Sea. In fact, by mid-June 2025, just as this war was heating up, U.S. bases in Syria again came under missile fire from Iranian-aligned groups. Those militia fighters launched rockets at least 3 U.S. outposts in northeastern Syria. Fortunately, all the missiles were shot down and no American soldiers were hurt. But the pattern was clear. Iranian-backed forces have been harassing U.S. interests across the region, and U.S. commanders warned that they would respond if those attacks continued. These proxy provocations helped drive Washington's decision-making as tensions with Iran rose. Now, the broader backdrop to this conflict includes the long-standing hostilities between Iran and Israel, which intensified sharply in 2024. Following the Hamas-Israel war, that started in 2023, Iran escalated its direct involvement by supplying advanced weaponry to Hezbollah in Lebanon and stepping up rocket attacks in Syria and Iraq. In early 2025, Israel launched airstrikes on Iranian weapons depots in Damascus and Latakia, and in retaliation, Iran conducted its most direct missile attack on Israel in decades, targeting Tel Aviv and Haifa. U.S. officials, including those in the Pentagon and the White House, have publicly stated that the June strikes were also motivated by a need to support Israel's security and to deter further Iranian aggression against its regional allies. Now, President Trump declared that the U.S. would, quote, not allow our closest ally in the region to stand alone against what he termed as a, quote, an increasingly bold and reckless Iran. That brings us to just this week. On June 21st and the 22nd, the U.S. took the unprecedented step of directly striking inside Iran. In a pre-dawned operation dubbed Operation Midnight Hammer, U.S. Air Force B-2 stealth bombers hit 3 of Iran's most sensitive nuclear sites. The U.S. used 14 30,000-pound, quote, bunker buster MOP bombs dropped from the B-2s, plus around 30 Tomahawk cruise missiles fired from a submarine. These strikes occurred in the early hours of June 22nd local time, and later that night, President Donald Trump announced on social media that the U.S. was, quote, very successful in an attack which had, quote, obliterated Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities. He warned that Iran now must take peace or face greater consequences. Now, the Pentagon described the raids as a highly sophisticated operation involving over 125 aircraft and 75 bombs, saying it had devastated Iran's nuclear infrastructure. However, a classified Pentagon assessment leaked to the press 2 days later that revealed that the damages to Iran's nuclear facilities may have been less severe than initially claimed. According to the report, while surface infrastructure at Natanz and Isfahan were destroyed, much of the underground centrifuge network at Fordow remained operational, albeit temporarily disrupted. Analysts stated that the facilities were, quote, impaired but not dismantled, contradicting earlier White House claims of a complete knockout. This has led to growing debate in Washington over the effectiveness of the mission. Iran's own Red Crescent Emergency Agency reported no casualties and only superficial damage at the facilities, and the initial U.S. assessments suggested that the deeply buried centrifuge halls at Fordow and Natanz may have survived, largely intact. Importantly, this U.S. strike marked the first time an American president has targeted another country's nuclear program. Trump's administration justified the action as necessary to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons and to support its ally, Israel. In Congress, most Republican leaders applauded the strikes, while many Democrats questioned the legality and wisdom of attacking a sovereign state without congressional approval. In his televised address after the attack, Trump emphasized that all U.S. aircraft had left Iranian airspace and that the mission was a, quote, spectacular military success. Within hours, their foreign minister denounced U.S. strikes as a, quote, grave violation of the United Nations Charter and warned of everlasting consequences. Iranian leaders said that the country reversed all options to defend its sovereignty. True to that threat, on June 23rd, Iran launched a ballistic missile attack on Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, which hosts thousands of U.S. troops, but Pentagon officials reported that all incoming rockets were intercepted and no Americans were injured. And just to be clear, this was a measured warning shot retaliation, purely symbolic. Hours before of the situation, they were all warned. Evacuation warnings were given. This was never intended to be a true retaliation, only to show that, like, we can and we could attack. But the actual missiles that were launched were never meant to be an actual attack. The Iranian militias also vowed to retaliate further against any U.S. presence in the region. In parallel, Iran continued its missiles barrages against Israel, and some Iranian officials even discussed closing the Strait of Hormuz to global shipping if attacked. Basically, in short, Tehran responded forcefully in words and deed, raising the stakes for further escalation. Now, the U.S. strikes prompted a wave of international reaction. NATO members and many Western governments did not explicitly endorse the attacks, and the UN in particular urged calm. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said he was gravely alarmed and warned that the strikes risked catastrophic consequences for civilians and the entire world. He stressed that there was no military solution and urged all parties to pursue diplomacy. In Europe and Asia, leaders expressed concern that the conflict would spiral. In contrast, Israel, which had pressured the U.S. to act, publicly congratulated America. The Israeli Prime Minister praised Trump's bold decision and said history would remember America's role in preventing Iran from getting nuclear weapons. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, Iran's allies in the region were furious. The Palestinian group Hamas condemned the U.S.'s aggression as a dangerous escalation and voiced solidarity with Iran. Lebanon's Hezbollah denounced the strikes as barbaric and treacherous and warned that they could expand the war. In short, global opinion split sharply along familiar lines. U.S. allies largely supported or accepted the action, though urging caution, while Iran's partners condemned it. Now, analysts warn that this confrontation now threatens to draw many countries deeper into conflict. With the U.S. intervening directly, the Israeli-Iran war has entered a new phase. Experts caution that Iran will almost certainly try to retaliate, perhaps by striking U.S. bases along the Persian Gulf, which could spark a broader war involving Iran, Israel, and other regional powers. Such a spiral would be profoundly negative for the Middle East, potentially drawing in U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia or even Turkey, and increasing the risk of fighting in multiple theaters. There's also serious global implications. In economic terms, any disruption of oil exports would ripple worldwide. Roughly 20% of the world's oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz, just off of Iran's coast, and analysts note that if Iran or the Houthi proxies were close to that route, energy's prices would skyrocket. In fact, the Houthis have already hinted that they may resume attacks on the Red Sea, shipping in solidarity with Iran, which could further destabilize global trade. Moreover, the United Nations warned that this crisis risks dragging in the global community, and the danger was a, quote, spiral of chaos is real, and emphasized that there is no military solution to this, only diplomacy. So, overall, in short, the U.S. strikes have dramatically raised the stakes. If Iran opts for limited retaliation against U.S. forces, it could provoke further U.S. action. If Iran pushes harder by attacking U.S. allies or closing key waterways, the region could slide towards an all-out war. As one analyst put it, Americans may soon find themselves deeper into the conflict, despite widespread reluctance to fight. In any case, the coming days will be critical, and all eyes are on Tehran and Washington, and on international leaders calling urgently for de-escalation. The hope is that the cooler heads will prevail, but as global leaders caution, the consequences of miscalculation could be catastrophic. So that was an overall view of what's going on. Let us know your thoughts. What's going to happen? We're going to see. Thank you guys for watching. Let us know if we should continue doing these longer videos, because we'd love to make those. All right. Thank you guys.